Welcome to our channel. Today's story unfolds as a former inmate lands a nursing job caring for a wealthy man abandoned by his family. Then, just 3 weeks later, something crazy happens. Don't forget to subscribe and, if you can, consider donating via the link in the pinned comment to help us create more amazing content. Now, let's dive into this incredible story. Marlene Sinclair took a deep breath as she stood outside the imposing gates of the Blackwood estate. At 32, she was starting over, her past mistakes weighing heavily on her shoulders. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn, as if nature itself was trying to hide her checkered history. 3 years in prison for fraud had taught Marlene valuable lessons. She'd made poor choices, desperate to save her dying mother, but the price she paid was steep. Now, with her debts to society settled, she was determined to forge a new path. The job advertisement had seemed too good to be true. Live-in nurse for a wealthy recluse. No questions asked about past experience. Marlene had applied on a whim, never expecting to hear back. Yet here she was, clutching her meager belongings, ready to start anew. As she approached the towering oak doors, they swung open silently. A stern-faced housekeeper, Mrs. Graves, greeted her with a curt nod. "You must be the new nurse," she said, her voice as crisp as her starched uniform. "Come along, then. Mr. Blackwood doesn't like to be kept waiting." Marlene followed Mrs. Graves through a maze of opulent hallways, her footsteps muffled by plush carpets. The air was heavy with the scent of old money and secrets. Family portraits lined the walls, stern faces seeming to judge her with every step. Finally, they reached a set of double doors. Mrs. Graves paused, fixing Marlene with a piercing stare. "Mr. Blackwood is particular. Mind your manners and do as you're told. This job is a privilege, not a right." With that ominous warning, she pushed open the doors. The room beyond was dimly lit, the curtains drawn against the fading daylight. In the center, illuminated by a single lamp, sat an old man in a wheelchair. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, but there was an unmistakable air of authority about him. "So, you're the new nurse," he said, his voice surprisingly strong. "Come closer, let me look at you." Marlene approached cautiously, her heart pounding. This was her chance at redemption, an opportunity to prove she was more than her past mistakes. As she stepped into the pool of light, Mr. Blackwood's eyes widened in recognition. "You," he whispered, a mixture of shock and something else. Was it fear, crossing his face? "I know you." Marlene froze, her blood running cold. How could he possibly know her? She'd never met this man before, unless her past had caught up with her already. Was this all an elaborate trap? But before she could respond, Mr. Blackwood's expression changed. A sly smile crept across his face, and he leaned back in his wheelchair. Well, he mused. "This should be interesting. Welcome to Blackwood Manor, Mrs. Sinclair. I have a feeling your time here will be enlightening for both of us." As Marlene stood there, caught between fight and flight, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just stepped into something far more complex than a simple nursing job. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, and she could almost hear the whispers of secrets long buried. Little did she know, her journey at Blackwood Manor was about to take her on a roller coaster of emotions, revelations, and dangers she could never have imagined. The next 3 weeks would change her life forever, testing her resolve, her morals, and her very understanding of the world around her. As the days passed, Marlene found herself settling into an uneasy routine at Blackwood Manor. The sprawling estate seemed to hold more secrets than answers, and her enigmatic patient, Mr. Elias Blackwood, proved to be a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. Every morning, she would arrive at his chambers promptly at 7 a.m., armed with medications and a forced smile. Elias would greet her with that same knowing look, as if he were privy to some cosmic joke at her expense. Their conversations were a delicate dance of probing questions and evasive answers. "Tell me, Ms. Sinclair," Elias asked one particularly gloomy morning, his pale blue eyes fixed on her face. "What brings a woman with your unique background to seek employment as a nurse?" Marlene felt her pulse quicken. "I've always had a passion for helping others," she replied, carefully measuring her words. My past experiences have only strengthened that desire." Elias chuckled, a dry sound that seemed to scratch at the air. "Ah, yes, your past experiences. Quite the euphemism, wouldn't you agree?" Before Marlene could respond, a crash echoed from somewhere deep within the manor. She jumped, startled, but Elias remained unnaturally still, his expression unreadable. "Pay it no mind," he said softly. "This old house has many ghosts, both literal and figurative." As the days turned into weeks, Marlene found herself drawn deeper into the web of mysteries surrounding Blackwood Manor. Strange noises in the night, doors that locked themselves, and whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered a room. It all added up to something sinister. Mrs. Graves, the housekeeper, was no help. Her frosty demeanor never thawed, and she seemed to appear and disappear at will, always watching Marlene with suspicious eyes. One afternoon, while Elias napped, Marlene decided to do some exploring. She found herself in a dusty library, its shelves groaning under the weight of ancient tomes. As she ran her fingers along the spines, a thin volume caught her eye. It was a family history of the Blackwoods. Curious, she opened it, and a photograph fluttered to the floor. When she picked it up, her blood ran cold. The woman in the picture could have been her twin, right down to the small scar above her left eyebrow. The caption read, "Elizabeth Blackwood, 1923. "Find something interesting?" Marlene whirled around to find Elias in the doorway, his wheelchair silent on the thick carpet. How long had he been watching her? I was just," she stammered, trying to hide the photograph. "No need for excuses, my dear," Elias said, wheeling closer. "I see you've met your great-grandmother." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "My... what?" Marlene gasped. Elias's eyes glittered in the dim light. "Oh yes, Elizabeth was quite the scandal in her day. Ran off with a penniless artist, abandoning her family and her fortune. We Blackwoods have long memories, you see. And when I saw your application, well, let's just say I couldn't resist the opportunity to bring a lost lamb back into the fold." Marlene's mind raced. Could it be true? Was this why she'd always felt like an outsider in her own family? But then a chilling thought struck her. If you knew who I was, why didn't you say anything when I arrived? Elias's smile was cold as ice. "My dear, where would be the fun in that? Besides, I needed to be sure you were worthy of the Blackwood name. And I must say, your little stint in prison was quite disappointing." Anger flared in Marlene's chest. "You have no right to judge me. You don't know anything about my life." "Oh, but I do," Elias countered. "I know everything about you, Marlene. Your hopes, your fears, your deepest secrets. And now, you're going to help me with a little project. You see, there's a reason my family abandoned me. They thought they could bury the truth, but I'm going to bring it all to light. And you, my dear, are the key." As Elias spoke, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Marlene felt a chill run down her spine, realizing that she had stumbled into something far more dangerous than she could have imagined. The next few days would test her in ways she never thought possible, forcing her to confront not only her own past but the dark legacy of the Blackwood family. Little did she know, the true horrors were yet to come, and the lines between ally and enemy would blur beyond recognition. The revelation of her connection to the Blackwood family left Marlene reeling. She spent the next few days in a daze, going through her nursing duties mechanically while her mind raced with questions. Every corner of the manor now seemed to hold whispers of her hidden heritage, and she found herself studying the old portraits with new eyes, searching for familiar features. Elias, for his part, seemed to revel in her discomfort. His cryptic comments and knowing smirks only added to Marlene's growing sense of unease. But it was clear he was waiting for something. biding his time before revealing the true nature of the project he had mentioned. On the evening of her third week at Blackwood Manor, everything changed. Marlene was making her final rounds, checking on Elias before retiring for the night. When she heard raised voices coming from his study, curiosity overrode caution, and she crept closer to listen. "You can't do this, Elias." It was Mrs. Graves, her usually composed voice trembling with emotion. "Think of the consequences. The consequences." Elias spat. "I've thought of nothing else for 40 years. It's time the truth came to light, no matter the cost." "But the girl," Mrs. Graves began. "Marlene is the key," Elias interrupted. "Whether she knows it or not, her very existence will bring it all crashing down." Heart pounding, Marlene leaned closer to the door. What were they talking about? What truth was so dangerous that it had consumed Elias for decades? Suddenly, the floor creaked beneath her feet. The voices inside fell silent. Panicking, Marlene turned to flee, but she wasn't fast enough. The door flew open, revealing Elias in his wheelchair, his eyes blazing with an unsettling mix of triumph and madness. "Ah, Marlene," he said, his voice deceptively calm. "I was hoping you'd join us. It's time we had a little chat about your role in all this." Trapped, Marlene allowed herself to be ushered into the study. Mrs. Graves stood by the fireplace, her face ashen, refusing to meet Marlene's questioning gaze. Elias wheeled himself behind an ornate desk and fixed Marlene with a penetrating stare. "Tell me, my dear, what do you know about your grandmother? Your real grandmother, not the woman who raised you." Marlene swallowed hard. "Nothing," she admitted. I didn't even know I was adopted until a few days ago." Elias nodded, as if he had expected this answer. Elizabeth Blackwood was a remarkable woman. Brilliant, beautiful, and possessing a moral compass that unfortunately led her astray. She uncovered a terrible secret about this family, one that could have destroyed everything the Blackwoods had built over generations. He paused, his gnarled hands gripping the arms of his wheelchair. Instead of using that information for personal gain, she chose to run, to protect herself and the child she carried, your mother. Marlene's head spun. "What secret?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias's eyes glittered in the firelight. "The Blackwood fortune was built on blood, my dear. On theft, murder, and a conspiracy that reaches to the highest levels of government. Your great-grandmother discovered proof that could topple empires and rewrite history books." "But that was nearly a century ago," Marlene protested. "Surely it doesn't matter now." "Oh, but it does," Elias countered. "The rot at the core of this family has only spread. The current generation of Blackwoods, my own children and grandchildren, have taken the family's dark legacy to new heights. They're planning something big, something that could plunge the entire country into chaos. And they left me here to rot because I threatened to expose them." Marlene felt as if the floor was tilting beneath her feet. "And what does any of this have to do with me?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. Elias leaned forward, his eyes burning with intensity. "You, my dear, are living proof of Elizabeth's existence. The family has worked hard to erase her from history, to pretend she never existed. But you are the loose thread that, when pulled, will unravel their entire tapestry of lies." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a thick folder. "This contains everything Elizabeth discovered, along with my own research over the years. Names, dates, bank accounts, everything needed to bring the truth to light. And you, Marlene, are going to be the one to deliver it." "Me?" Marlene gasped. "But I'm nobody. I'm an ex-con with no connections, no influence. Who would believe me?" Elias's smile was cold and calculated. "That, my dear, is precisely why it has to be you. Your very lack of credibility is what makes you perfect. They'll never see you coming." As the weight of Elias's words sank in, Marlene felt a chill run down her spine. She had come to Blackwood Manor seeking a fresh start, a chance to rebuild her life. Instead, she found herself at the center of a century-old conspiracy, holding the match that could set the world ablaze. Little did she know, the true test of her courage and character was yet to come. The choices she would make in the coming days would not only determine her own fate, but potentially alter the course of history itself. Marlene stumbled out of Elias's study, her mind reeling from the weight of the revelations. The thick folder he had given her felt like lead in her hands, its contents threatening to upend not just her life, but potentially the entire social order. As she made her way back to her small room in the servants' wing, the shadows in the hallways seemed to stretch and twist, as if the very house was reacting to the secrets now in her possession. Once safely behind her locked door, Marlene sank onto her bed, her hands shaking as she opened the folder. Page after page of meticulously documented evidence spilled out. Bank statements showing massive transfers to offshore accounts, photographs of clandestine meetings between Blackwood family members and high-ranking government officials, and most chillingly, detailed plans for what appeared to be a coordinated economic attack on the country's financial systems. As she pored over the documents, Marlene's initial skepticism gave way to a growing sense of horror. If even half of what Elias claimed was true, the Blackwood family's influence extended far beyond anything she could have imagined. But what could she, a former convict with no resources or connections, possibly do with this information? The next few days passed in a blur of anxiety and indecision. Marlene went through the motions of her nursing duties, hyper-aware of every glance from Mrs. Graves and every cryptic comment from Elias. She felt as if she were balancing on a knife's edge, the weight of her newfound knowledge threatening to topple her at any moment. On the fourth night after Elias's revelation, Marlene was startled awake by a soft tapping at her window. Heart pounding, she crept to the curtains and pulled them back, only to gasp in shock. There, perched precariously on the narrow ledge outside, was a young woman with familiar green eyes, eyes that mirrored her own. "Let me in, quickly," the woman hissed. "We don't have much time." Against her better judgment, Marlene unlatched the window. The stranger tumbled in, landing gracefully on her feet. Up close, the family resemblance was undeniable. "Who are you?" Marlene demanded, though she already suspected the answer. "I'm Lydia," the woman replied, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "I'm your cousin, and I'm here to warn you. You're in terrible danger." Over the next hour, Lydia painted a picture that made Elias's revelation seem tame by comparison. She spoke of a family divided, of a younger generation of Blackwoods who sought to use their inherited wealth and power to reshape the world in their image. Elias, she explained, was not the noble whistleblower he pretended to be, but a key player in a complex game of manipulation and counter-manipulation. "He's using you, Marlene," Lydia insisted, "just as the family has used and discarded people for generations. You're a pawn in a game you don't even understand." Marlene's mind raced, trying to reconcile this new information with everything she thought she knew. "But the evidence," she protested weakly. "The documents." Lydia's face softened with sympathy. "Some of it is real, yes. The Blackwood legacy is as dark as Elias claims, but he's twisted the truth, presenting himself as the lone voice of conscience when in reality, he's just as complicit as the rest." "Then what am I supposed to do?" Marlene asked, feeling more lost than ever. Lydia reached into her jacket and pulled out a small, high-tech device. "This contains the real story, not just of the Blackwoods, but of a network of families and corporations that have been manipulating global events for centuries. I'm part of a group working to expose it all, to break the cycle of corruption once and for all." She pressed the device into Marlene's hands. "We need your help. You're uniquely positioned. The lost Blackwood, the prodigal daughter returned. You can access places and information that we can't." Marlene stared at the device, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. "Why should I trust you?" she asked. "How do I know this isn't just another manipulation?" Lydia's gaze was steady and unflinching. "You don't. That's the hardest part of all this, knowing who to trust. But I'm offering you a chance to make a real difference, to use the hand you've been dealt to actually help people instead of just serving someone else's agenda. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the window, Marlene made her decision. She couldn't undo her past mistakes, but perhaps this was her opportunity to balance the scales. With a deep breath, she looked at Lydia and nodded. "Tell me what I need to do." Little did Marlene know, her choice would set in motion a chain of events that would shake the very foundations of power. In the coming days, she would be tested in ways she never imagined, forced to question everything she thought she knew about herself, her family, and the nature of truth itself. The game was afoot, and Marlene Sinclair, ex-convict, lost heir, and reluctant crusader, was about to become the most dangerous player on the board. The next morning, Marlene awoke with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. The weight of Lydia's revelations and the secret device hidden beneath her mattress filled her with equal parts excitement and dread. As she went about her morning routine, she couldn't help but see Blackwood Manor in a new light. Every ornate fixture and priceless artifact now seemed tainted, symbols of a corrupt legacy she was determined to expose. Elias was particularly chatty during their morning session, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling intensity. "You seem different today, my dear," he observed, studying her face. "Have you given any thought to our discussion?" Marlene forced herself to maintain a neutral expression. "I have," she replied carefully. "It's a lot to process." Elias chuckled, the sound dry and humorless. "Indeed it is, but time is of the essence. We must act soon if we're to prevent the family's plans from coming to fruition." As Elias launched into a detailed explanation of the supposed conspiracy, Marlene found herself analyzing every word, searching for the kernels of truth hidden within the lies. It was a delicate balancing act, appearing engaged and compliant while secretly gathering information for Lydia's group. Over the next few days, Marlene threw herself into her role as double agent. She used every opportunity to explore the manor, noting security measures and potential access points to restricted areas. When Elias was napping, she would sneak into his study, carefully photographing documents with a tiny camera Lydia had provided. But the deeper Marlene delved, the more complex the web of deceit became. She uncovered evidence that seemed to support both Elias's claims and Lydia's warnings. The Blackwood family's influence clearly extended far beyond what she had initially imagined, with tentacles reaching into governments, corporations, and shadowy organizations around the globe. One afternoon, while helping Elias sort through old correspondence, Marlene stumbled upon a letter that made her blood run cold. It was dated just weeks before her arrest for fraud, and it detailed a plan to manipulate her into committing the very crime she had been imprisoned for. The signatures at the bottom belonged to both Elias and her adoptive parents. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice shaking as she thrust the letter at Elias. For a moment, genuine surprise flashed across the old man's face. Then his expression hardened. "Ah," he said softly. "I had wondered when you might find that particular skeleton in our closet. You set me up." Marlene's mind reeled, memories of her desperate attempts to save her dying mother taking on a sinister new context. "But why?" Elias wheeled himself closer, his eyes never leaving her face. "My dear, surely you've realized by now that nothing in this family happens by chance. We needed you, malleable, isolated. Your little stint in prison was simply a means to an end." Rage boiled up inside Marlene, threatening to overwhelm her carefully constructed facade. "You ruined my life," she snarled. "My mother died while I was in prison, thinking I had betrayed everything she taught me." "A regrettable necessity," Elias replied, his tone maddeningly calm. But look at where you are now, Marlene. Positioned to make a real difference, wanting to expose corruption on a global scale. Isn't that worth the sacrifices made along the way?" Marlene wanted to scream, to lash out at this man who spoke so casually of destroying lives. But a small, cold voice in the back of her mind warned her to maintain control. She couldn't risk blowing her cover, not when she was so close to uncovering the truth. With a Herculean effort, she forced her anger down, plastering a look of reluctant understanding on her face. I need some time to process this," she managed to say. Elias nodded, a look of satisfaction crossing his features. "Of course, my dear. Take all the time you need. But remember, the clock is ticking. We must act soon." As Marlene fled the study, her mind was in turmoil. Who could she trust? Elias had manipulated her entire life, but was Lydia any better? Was she simply trading one puppet master for another? That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Marlene came to a decision. She couldn't trust anyone but herself. From now on, she would play both sides, gathering information and biding her time until she could determine the best course of action. Little did she know, her decision to walk the razor's edge between competing factions would soon put her in the crosshairs of forces far more dangerous than she could imagine. The game was escalating, and Marlene Sinclair, pawn-turned-player, was about to become the most hunted woman in the world. As the days passed, Marlene found herself caught in an increasingly complex web of lies and counter-lies. She continued to play her role as Elias's confidant and potential ally, all while secretly feeding information to Lydia's group. But with each passing day, the weight of her double life grew heavier. One stormy evening, as thunder rattled the windows of Blackwood Manor, Marlene was summoned to Elias's study. The old man seemed more agitated than usual, his eyes darting nervously to the shadows in the corners of the room. "It's time," he announced without preamble. "We must act now, before they realize what we're planning." Marlene's heart raced. "What do you mean? What's happening?" Elias wheeled himself to an ancient painting on the wall and pressed a hidden switch. The canvas swung aside, revealing a state-of-the-art computer setup. "Ours this," he said, gesturing to the screens, "is our key to bringing down the entire corrupt system." As Elias explained his plan, Marlene felt a chill run down her spine. He intended to use her as the face of a massive data leak, exposing not just the Blackwood family's crimes, but a vast network of global corruption. The information would be released to every major news outlet simultaneously, causing chaos in financial markets and toppling governments. "But won't that hurt innocent people?" Marlene asked, struggling to keep the horror from her voice. Elias waved his hand dismissively. "Collateral damage is unavoidable in a war like this. The system is too rotten to save. We must burn it all down and start anew." As Elias continued outlining his plan, Marlene's mind raced. This was far beyond anything she had anticipated. She needed to warn Lydia, to stop this before it was too late. But as she reached for her hidden communication device, a new voice cut through the room. "I'm afraid I can't let you do that, Uncle Elias." Marlene whirled around to see a tall, imposing man step out of the shadows. His resemblance to the portraits in the hall marked him unmistakably as a Blackwood. "Victor," Elias spat, his face contorting with rage. "I should have known you'd slither out of whatever hole you've been hiding in." Victor Blackwood's smile was cold and predatory. "Did you really think we'd let you destroy everything we've built? You're a relic, Uncle. A dinosaur who doesn't understand how the world works anymore." As the two men argued, their voices rising over the storm outside, Marlene edged towards the door. But before she could reach it, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find herself face to face with Lydia. "I'm sorry, Marlene," Lydia said, her eyes filled with genuine regret. "But we can't let you leave. You know too much." Suddenly, the room erupted into chaos. Victor's men poured in, grappling with Elias's hidden security team. Gunshots rang out, shattering the antique windows and sending glass flying everywhere. In the confusion, Marlene made a split-second decision. She dove for Elias's computer, grabbing a flash drive she had spotted earlier. As bullets whizzed past her head, she pocketed the drive and ran for her life. She tore through the winding corridors of Blackwood Manor, her heart pounding in her ears. Behind her, she could hear shouts and the sound of pursuit. She had no plan, no idea where to go, but she knew she couldn't let either faction get their hands on the information she now carried. As she rounded a corner, she collided with Mrs. Graves. The old housekeeper's eyes widened in recognition, then hardened with determination. To Marlene's shock, Mrs. Graves pressed a key into her hand. "The garage," she whispered urgently. "There's a car. Go, now." Marlene hesitated for a split second, searching the old woman's face for any sign of deception. But in that moment, she saw only a fierce protectiveness that reminded her of her adoptive mother. With a quick nod of thanks, Marlene sprinted for the garage. She found the car, a nondescript sedan with tinted windows, and jammed the key into the ignition. As the engine roared to life, she caught a glimpse of Victor and Lydia in the rearview mirror, both running towards her with weapons drawn. Without a second thought, Marlene floored the accelerator. The car burst through the garage doors in a shower of splinters, fishtailing on the rain-slicked driveway before finding purchase on the asphalt. As Blackwood Manor receded in her rearview mirror, Marlene realized that her life would never be the same. She was now in possession of information that could change the world, hunted by powerful forces that would stop at nothing to retrieve it. The storm raged around her as she sped into the night, her mind reeling from the evening's events. She had no idea where she was going or who she could trust, but one thing was certain: the real battle was just beginning. The rain lashed against the windshield as Marlene sped down the winding country roads, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Her mind raced faster than the car, trying to process the events of the last few hours. The weight of the flash drive in her pocket felt like a ticking time bomb. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the reality of her situation sank in. She was alone, with no resources, no allies, and in possession of information that made her the most wanted person in the Blackwood family's vast network. She needed a plan, and fast. First things first, she had to ditch the car. It was undoubtedly tracked, and staying on the road made her an easy target. As dawn broke, Marlene pulled into a bustling truck stop. She abandoned the sedan in the far corner of the parking lot and slipped into the restroom with the small bag she'd managed to grab during her escape. Looking at her reflection in the grimy mirror, Marlene hardly recognized herself. Her eyes were wild, her hair disheveled. With shaking hands, she pulled out a pair of scissors from her bag and began to cut. Long strands of hair fell into the sink as she transformed her appearance. A box of hair dye, hastily shoplifted from a nearby convenience store, completed her makeover. Emerging from the restroom, Marlene looked like a different person, a nondescript traveler with short, dark hair and unremarkable clothes. She bought a cheap baseball cap and sunglasses from the truck stop gift shop, further obscuring her features. Now came the hard part. She needed to access the information on the flash drive, but using any personal devices or public computers was out of the question. They would be too easy to trace. As she mulled over her options, a conversation at a nearby table caught her attention. Two truckers were complaining about a new electronic logging system that had been mandated for all commercial trucks. Marlene's ears perked up. Those systems would have computers, possibly with limited tracking due to their specialized nature. Swallowing her apprehension, Marlene approached the truckers. She spun a tale of being a stranded traveler, her car broken down and her phone dead. With a mixture of charm and carefully crafted desperation, she convinced one of the truckers to let her use his truck's computer system just to send a quick email to my family. Once inside the truck's cab, Marlene worked quickly. She inserted the flash drive, her heart pounding as she prayed it wouldn't trigger any alarms. To her relief, the files opened without issue. What she saw made her gasp. The drive contained not just evidence of the Blackwood family's crimes, but a comprehensive database of corrupt officials, business leaders, and criminals from around the world. Bank accounts, incriminating emails, recorded conversations. It was a goldmine of information that could bring down entire governments, but it was too much for her to process alone. She needed help, but who could she trust? As she pondered this, a name surfaced from her memory: Jonathan Reeves, an investigative journalist known for his exposés on corporate corruption. She had read his articles during her time in prison, admiring his tenacity and integrity. Using the trucker's email system, Marlene composed a carefully worded message to Reeves. She didn't reveal everything, but included just enough tantalizing information to pique his interest. She set up an encrypted email account and gave him instructions on how to contact her securely. As she was about to log out, a news alert flashed across the screen. Her blood ran cold as she saw her own face staring back at her. The headline read, "Former convict wanted for questioning in billionaire's murder." The article claimed that Elias Blackwood had been found dead in his study, and Marlene was the prime suspect. It was a clever move by whoever was pulling the strings. With law enforcement now involved, her options were severely limited. Thanking the trucker profusely, Marlene slipped out of the truck stop and into the nearby woods. She needed to keep moving, to stay ahead of both the Blackwoods and the police. As she trekked through the underbrush, her mind worked overtime. She had the evidence to clear her name and expose the truth, but releasing it immediately would be too dangerous. She needed a strategy, allies, and most importantly, a way to stay alive long enough to see this through. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Marlene Sinclair, former nurse, reluctant spy, and now fugitive, steeled herself for the challenges ahead. She had stumbled into a war she never asked for, but now found herself as the linchpin that could bring a centuries-old conspiracy crashing down. Little did she know, her message to Jonathan Reeves would set in motion a chain of events that would not only change her life, but potentially alter the course of history. The pieces were moving on the board, and the real game was about to begin. 3 days after her dramatic escape from Blackwood Manor, Marlene found herself huddled in a dingy motel room on the outskirts of a small Midwestern town. She'd been moving constantly, using cash only and staying off the grid as much as possible. The burner phone she had purchased buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Meet me at the abandoned factory on 5th and Main. Come alone. J.R." Marlene's heart raced. Jonathan Reeves had responded to her message. This could be the break she needed, or it could be a trap. After a moment's hesitation, she decided to take the risk. She had come too far to turn back now. As dusk fell, Marlene cautiously approached the derelict building. Her senses were on high alert, every shadow a potential threat. She slipped through a broken window, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the empty space. "Miss Sinclair?" a voice called out from the darkness. Marlene whirled around to see a man step out from behind a rusted piece of machinery. He was older than she expected, with graying hair and tired eyes that spoke of countless late nights chasing leads. "Mr. Reeves?" Marlene asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man nodded. "I got your message. I have to say, it's quite a story you're peddling, if even half of what you've hinted at is true." "It's all true," Marlene interrupted. "And there's more, so much more." She pulled out the flash drive, holding it up like a talisman. "Everything's on here, but I need your help to make sense of it all, to figure out the best way to release the information without getting myself killed in the process." Reeves' eyes widened at the sight of the drive. He reached for it, but Marlene quickly pulled it back. "Not so fast," she said. "I need to know I can trust you." A small smile played at the corners of Reeves' mouth. "Smart girl. Trust is a rare commodity these days." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick file. "I've been investigating the Blackwoods and their associates for years. This is everything I've managed to piece together. It's not nearly as comprehensive as what you have, but it should be enough to convince you that we're on the same side." As Marlene flipped through the file, her amazement grew. Reeves had uncovered connections and patterns that she hadn't even considered. Together, their information could blow the lid off the entire conspiracy. Just as they were beginning to discuss strategy, a noise from outside caught their attention. Flashlight beams swept across the windows, and gruff voices could be heard giving orders. "Damn," Reeves muttered. "They must have followed me. We need to move now." But it was too late. The doors burst open, and armed men in tactical gear poured in. Marlene and Reeves found themselves surrounded, with no way out. To Marlene's shock, a familiar face stepped forward, Victor Blackwood. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with false cordiality. "The prodigal daughter, And the muckraking journalist. What an interesting pair you make. Marlene's mind raced, searching for a way out of this impossible situation. But before she could act, another voice rang out from the shadows. I wouldn't be so smug if I were you, Victor. Lydia stepped into view, flanked by her own team of armed individuals. The standoff had suddenly become a three-way confrontation. You're outnumbered, Victor snarled. Do you really think you can stop us? Lydia's smile was cold. Numbers aren't everything, cousin. Besides, we're not alone. As if on cue, the sounds of police sirens filled the air. Through the windows, Marlene could see flashing lights approaching rapidly. Chaos erupted. Victor's men opened fire, while Lydia's team took cover and returned fire. Marlene felt a hand grab her arm. It was Reeves, pulling her towards a hidden exit he had scouted earlier. As they ran through the back alleys, explosions and gunfire echoed behind them. Marlene's mind was reeling. Who had called the police? Was it Reeves? Lydia? Or was there another player in this deadly game that she hadn't accounted for? They ran until their lungs burned, finally stopping in a quiet park several blocks away. As they caught their breath, Reeves turned to Marlene with a grim expression. I hope you realize what you've gotten yourself into, he said. This goes deeper than either of us imagined. We're not just dealing with one corrupt family. This is a shadow war that's been going on for generations. Marlene nodded, the weight of their situation settling on her shoulders. So what do we do now? Reeves' eyes glinted with determination. We do what journalists and whistleblowers have always done. We gather evidence, we find allies, and we shine a light on the darkness. But we have to be smart about it. One wrong move and we're both dead. As dawn broke over the city, Marlene Sinclair and Jonathan Reeves shook hands, cementing an alliance that would change both their lives forever. They had evidence that could topple empires, but they were up against forces with near-limitless resources and a centuries-old grip on power. The real battle was just beginning, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Little did they know, their next move would uncover a truth so shocking that it would shake the very foundations of society. Over the next few weeks, Marlene and Jonathan Reeves worked tirelessly, holed up in a series of safe houses provided by Reeves' network of trusted contacts. They pored over the data from the flash drive, cross-referencing it with Reeves' years of research. The picture that emerged was more terrifying than either of them had imagined. The Blackwood family was just one piece of a vast, interconnected web of power that spanned the globe. Corporations, governments, even religious institutions, all were puppets, dancing on strings pulled by a hidden elite. This group, which called itself the Consortium, had been manipulating world events for centuries, steering the course of history from the shadows. But as they dug deeper, Marlene and Reeves discovered something that changed everything. Hidden within the encrypted files was evidence of a schism within the Consortium itself. It seemed that a faction had formed, one that believed their actions had gone too far, pushing the world to the brink of collapse. This is it, Reeves breathed, his eyes wide as he stared at the screen. This is why Elias gave you the drive. He wasn't just trying to expose the family's crimes. He was part of this rebel faction. Marlene felt a chill run down her spine. But why me? Why go through all the trouble of manipulating my life? The answer, when they found it, left them both stunned. Buried deep in the files was a DNA analysis. Marlene's DNA. She wasn't just a long-lost Blackwood. She was the direct descendant of the Consortium's founding members. Her very existence was a threat to the power structure that had stood for generations. They've been watching you your entire life, Reeves said softly, waiting to see if you'd manifest the abilities they believe are inherent in your bloodline. Abilities? Marlene scoffed. What am I supposed to be, some kind of superhero? But as Reeves explained, the truth was far stranger. The Consortium believed that certain bloodlines had enhanced intuitive abilities, a kind of genetic foresight that allowed them to predict and manipulate future events with uncanny accuracy. It was this power that had allowed them to maintain their control for so long. This is insane, Marlene muttered, running her hands through her hair. I'm just me. I'm nobody special. Reeves looked at her intently. Are you sure about that? Think back. Haven't there been times when you just knew something was going to happen? Decisions you made that seemed illogical at the time but turned out to be exactly right. Marlene wanted to deny it, but flashes of memory gave her pause. The sudden urge to change her routine the day before a major accident on her usual route. The inexplicable feeling that led her to apply for the nursing job at Blackwood Manor. Even her split-second decisions during her escape, had they all been guided by some hidden part of herself? As they grappled with these revelations, a new message arrived through one of Reeves' secure channels. It was from Lydia. They're moving forward with the final stage. We're out of time. Meet me at the coordinates attached. Bring everything. Marlene and Reeves shared a look of grim determination. Whatever was coming, it was clear that the endgame was approaching. They gathered their evidence and encrypted backups of all their data and prepared to face whatever lay ahead. As they drove through the night towards the meeting point, Marlene felt a strange sense of calm settling over her. For the first time since this all began, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Whether it was her newfound knowledge of her heritage or simply the resolve that comes from facing overwhelming odds, she couldn't say. What she did know was that the next few days would determine not just her fate, but potentially the fate of the entire world. The Consortium's power was built on secrecy and manipulation. By exposing them, by giving people the truth, there was a chance to break their hold once and for all. But as they approached their destination, a nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of Washington, D.C., Marlene couldn't shake the feeling that the biggest revelations were yet to come. The pieces were all in place, the players assembled. Now it was time for the final act to begin. Little did Marlene know, the choice she would soon face would not only test her newfound abilities but also challenge everything she believed about right or wrong and the very nature of free will itself. As Marlene and Reeves approached the warehouse, the air seemed to crackle with tension. They were greeted by Lydia, her face drawn with worry and exhaustion. Inside, they found a makeshift command center, filled with computers and anxious faces, the remnants of the Consortium's rebel faction. We don't have much time, Lydia said without preamble. The Loyalists are initiating what they call the Great Reset. They plan to trigger a series of engineered crises, economic collapse, environmental disasters, even limited nuclear exchanges. In the chaos that follows, they'll reshape the world order, tightening their control beyond anything we've seen before. The room erupted into frantic activity as Lydia's team worked to counter the impending catastrophe. Marlene and Reeves shared their findings, the revelations about Marlene's heritage causing a stir among the rebels. As the hours ticked by, Marlene found herself at the center of a storm of information and decision-making. Her mind raced, processing data and strategies at a speed that both exhilarated and terrified her. Was this the ability Reeves had spoken of? Suddenly, alarms blared throughout the facility. "They've found us," someone shouted. The Loyalists, led by Victor Blackwood, had launched an all-out assault on the rebel base. In the chaos that followed, Marlene made a split-second decision. "The broadcast center," she said to Reeves, her voice filled with certainty she didn't fully understand. "We need to get there now." As they fought their way through the complex, Marlene felt as if she were in a state of heightened awareness. Every decision, every movement seemed guided by an invisible hand. They reached the broadcast center just as Victor and his men broke through the final defenses. "It's over, Marlene," Victor sneered, his gun trained on her heart. "Did you really think you could stop what's been in motion for centuries?" But Marlene wasn't listening. Her eyes were fixed on a bank of computers, her fingers flying over the keyboards. With Reeves providing cover fire, she initiated a global broadcast, overriding every television, radio, and internet channel worldwide. "People of the world," she began, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "What I'm about to tell you will change everything you thought you knew about our society, our history, and our future." For the next 10 minutes, as bullets flew and the building shook with explosions, Marlene laid bare the truth about the Consortium. She exposed their manipulations, their crimes, and their plans for the future. But more than that, she spoke about choice, about the power of individuals to shape their own destinies. They want you to believe that your lives are predetermined, that you're powerless against the forces that shape our world, she said, her voice growing stronger. But I'm living proof that they're wrong. We all have the power to choose, to stand up against injustice, to write our own stories. As she spoke, something extraordinary happened. Around the world, people began to wake up. Protests erupted in cities across the globe. Government officials, realizing the game was up, began to confess. The carefully constructed house of cards that was the Consortium's power began to crumble. In the broadcast center, Victor watched in disbelief as his world fell apart. "What have you done?" he whispered, his gun lowering. Marlene turned to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and resolve. "I've given people the truth. What they do with it is up to them." In the days that followed, the world was plunged into a period of chaos and revelation. But from the ashes of the old order, something new began to emerge. People, armed with the truth and a newfound sense of empowerment, started to rebuild their societies based on transparency and genuine democracy. Marlene, hailed as a hero by some and vilified by others, retreated from the public eye. She knew her work wasn't over. There would always be those who sought to control others, and the temptation to use her abilities for personal gain was ever present. As she stood on the balcony of a safe house, watching the sun rise over a world forever changed, Reeves joined her. "So, what now?" he asked. Marlene smiled, feeling the weight of her heritage and the lightness of true freedom. "Now," she said, "we keep fighting. We keep exposing the truth. We keep reminding people that their choices matter." She turned to look at him, her eyes bright with purpose. "The story isn't over, Jonathan. In fact, I think it's just beginning." As they looked out over the awakening city, Marlene Sinclair, ex-convict, reluctant hero, and guardian of truth, felt a sense of hope she had never known before. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in centuries, the future was unwritten, waiting for billions of free individuals to shape it together. The end, or perhaps just a new beginning.